Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
That afternoon by Willow Lake, with the sun dipping low and turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold, I stood on the weathered dock my late husband built 30 years ago. Watching my daughter-in-law Lisa heave that heavy black suitcase over the edge like it was yesterday's trash, her face twisted in something between rage and relief that made my stomach knot up tighter than a fisherman's line. Because in all the years she'd been married to my son Tom, I'd never seen her move with such deliberate finality, as if she were slamming a door on more than just luggage, and it hit the surface with a dull splash that sent ripples racing outward like unspoken accusations, followed by a muffled bang from inside that echoed across the quiet water, sounding eerily like a suppressed cry or perhaps something mechanical giving way under pressure, jolting me from my reverie of sorting through faded memories of family barbecues and lazy boat rides that once filled these summer days, prompting me to kick off my sandals without a second thought despite the twinge in my arthritic knees that the doctor always warned me about during those routine checkups in town, and I waded into the chilly murk up to my waist, the cold seeping through my cotton skirt like an unwelcome truth, my hands grasping the handle of the suitcase as it bobbed stubbornly against the current, hauling it back toward the splintered planks with a grunt that betrayed my 62 years, but not my stubborn resolve forged from raising two boys on a secretary's salary back when the mill was still humming and dreams didn't come with foreclosure notices attached. Water streamed off the black nylon as I collapsed onto the dock, my breath coming in ragged bursts from the effort and the growing dread that this wasn't some innocent discard, but a deliberate act tied to the tensions that had been simmering in our family ever since Tom started coming home late from his construction gigs with excuses that didn't quite add up. And Lisa's eyes lingering too long on the property listings during holiday dinners where we'd pretend everything was fine over plates of potato salad and corn on the cob, and, with trembling fingers slick from the lake, I tugged at the zipper that gave way with a rasping sound, revealing a jumble of contents that stole the air from my lungs in one gasping moment, starting with Tom's worn leather wallet stained with what looked like fresh blood smeared across the edges, his driver's license photo, gazing up at me with that familiar lopsided grin he'd inherited from his father Harold. The one that always melted my frustrations, whether it was over scraped knees from playground falls or later over bounce checks from those half-baked business ideas he chased after dropping out of community college. But now the crimson spots turned my stomach because the last time I'd seen Tom was 3 months prior when he showed up unannounced at the cabin, unshaven and jittery, rambling about Lisa's ambitious plans to develop the lakefront land his dad had left us in the will, the very spot where we'd gathered every Labor Day since the kids were toddlers, toasting to simpler times amid the scent of grilled burgers and the distant hum of outboard motors. Nestled beside the wallet was a crumpled scrap of paper in Tom's unmistakable scrawl, the ink slightly blurred but legible enough to pierce my heart with the words, "Forgive me, but she can't know," a message that hung in the air like a half-formed confession, making me wonder immediately who she referred to if not Lisa herself, the polished real estate agent Tom had brought home 5 years ago with promises of stability and a future that would ease the financial strains we'd all felt since the recession hit and Harold's pension barely covered the property taxes that kept climbing like weeds in an untended garden, and then my eyes caught a cold metallic glint at the bottom of the case, partially wrapped in a damp towel that smelled faintly of motor oil and regret, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the evaporating lake water on my skin, because it looked like the barrel of a handgun, small and ominous, the kind that no one in our family had any business owning after Harold's old hunting rifle went missing years back during a garage cleanup that Tom had helped with, or so he claimed. Though now I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that this was tied to the hushed arguments I'd overheard between him and Lisa about debts piling up from her latest flip project that went south when the market soured again. I quickly re-zipped the suitcase, my mind racing through a whirlwind of possibilities, from Tom being in some accident during one of his out-of-town jobs to something far darker involving Lisa's secretive phone calls that I'd pretended not to notice during her visits, the ones where she'd step out onto the porch with that forced casualness, her voice dropping to whispers that carried on the wind, and shoving the heavy thing behind a stack of life preservers stored under the dock bench, I straightened up just in time to see Lisa emerging from the tree line at the yard's edge. Her blonde ponytail still swinging with feigned nonchalance, as if she hadn't just attempted to erase a piece of our family history in the depths where bass lurked and old fishing lures tangled forever, and I called out to her in a voice steadier than I felt, "Lisa, honey, what on earth were you tossing?" In the lake like that, looked heavy enough to sink a boat, but she waved it off with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression that reminded me of used car salesmen at the county fair, claiming it was nothing but old clothes and junk from the attic that she'd been meaning to clear out for a garage sale to help with the bills, her words landing with a casualness that rang false given how her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sundress, betraying the nerves she tried to mask. With chatter about the weather turning cooler soon and how we should plan a family cookout before the leaves fully changed, I nodded along, inviting her inside the cabin for a glass of iced tea to cool off, the screen door creaking on its hinges as we stepped into the familiar space filled with Harold's old nautical charts pinned to the walls and the faint aroma of pine from the floorboards he sanded himself. But all the while my thoughts churned on that bloodied wallet and the cryptic note, leading me to probe gently during our conversation at the kitchen table where the sunlight slanted through the lace curtains. My mother had sewn decades ago, mentioning how Tom had seemed off lately and asking if she'd heard from him since his last call, watching her pause mid-sip with a flicker of something like panic before she recovered, assuring me he was fine, just tied up with a big contract upstate, and that the suitcase really was harmless, though her insistence only fueled my doubts because why the rush to dump it if there was nothing to hide? And as she rose to leave, citing an appointment in town, I felt a spark of that old resourcefulness that had gotten me through lean years, the kind where I'd haggle at flea markets for extras to stretch the grocery budget. So I casually remarked that I'd seen her struggling with it and offered to help sort through whatever was left, but she brushed it aside too quickly, her laughter a bit too bright as she headed for her car parked by the gravel drive. Once she was out of sight, I retrieved the suitcase from its hiding spot, dragging it up to my bedroom where the afternoon light filtered through the blinds, and as I unpacked it more carefully this time, laying out the items on the quilt Harold and I picked out during our honeymoon trip to the Finger Lakes, I discovered a motel key card from a roadside place called Pine Rest over near Syracuse, the plastic worn but the number clear, along with a lipstick tube in a bold red shade that clashed with Lisa's usual neutral palette and a crumpled receipt for takeout Chinese dated just a week ago, all pieces that painted a picture of Tom's life unraveling in ways I hadn't anticipated, making me chuckle wryly to myself at the irony of playing detective in my own sunset years when I'd always prided myself on being the steady one who kept the family afloat without needing to stir up waves. But that seed of action wouldn't let me rest, so I picked up the landline and dialed our longtime neighbor Ed, the retired sheriff's deputy who shared fishing stories with Harold over beers on this very dock, mentioning offhand during our chat about the garden harvest how I'd spotted Lisa by the water earlier looking a bit flustered while tossing out some old gear, knowing full well that Ed's wife belonged to the local women's auxiliary that thrived on such tidbits, ensuring the story would ripple through the community gossip mill by evening like stones skipped across the lake, a subtle payback that felt satisfying in its clever restraint, because if Lisa thought she could bury secrets without consequence, I'd remind her that in a place like this, nothing stays submerged for long without someone noticing the bubbles. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard where the wildflowers nodded in the breeze, my cell phone vibrated on the nightstand with an unknown caller, and when I answered, a low voice that sent chills racing down my arms hissed, "Maggie, you should have left that bag where it was. Now back off before you drag the whole family down with whatever Tom's gotten into," the line clicking dead before I could respond, leaving me seated on the edge of the bed with the suitcase open like a Pandora's box, heart pounding as I realized this mystery reached deeper than the lake's murky bottom, with Lisa potentially knowing far more about my son's fate than she'd ever admit, and the metallic glint of that gun now seeming like the first shot in a battle I never signed up for. The anonymous call's warning lingered in my ears like a bad aftertaste from overbrewed coffee as I tossed and turned that night in the cabin's lumpy bed. The sheets twisted around me while moonlight filtered through the thin curtains to dance shadows across the walls adorned with Harold's faded fishing trophies and the family portraits that now seemed to mock my naivety about the cracks running through our lives. Because if someone knew I'd fished that suitcase from the water and was bold enough to threaten me over the phone, it meant Tom's disappearance, or whatever this mess truly was, had tentacles reaching into places I hadn't imagined, pulling at threads tied to Lisa's secretive dealings and the financial quicksand our family had been sinking into ever since the economy tanked and Tom's construction foreman job evaporated along with half the local workforce, leaving him to pick up odd gigs that barely covered the mortgage on their modest ranch house 2 towns over. The one Lisa had insisted on buying with her real estate commissions that always seemed just a bit inflated during those tense dinner conversations where we'd skirt around the topic of money like it was a live wire. By morning, with the sun struggling through a haze of clouds that promised another humid day perfect for mosquito swarms around the dock, I shook off the chills from the call and decided passivity wasn't in my playbook anymore. Not after raising boys who tested every boundary from joyriding in the old Ford to skipping school for arcade marathons. So after a quick breakfast of oatmeal laced with the wild blueberries I'd picked along the lakeside trail the week before, I fired up the ancient desktop computer in Harold's study, the machine wheezing to life amid stacks of back issues of Field and Stream that gathered dust since his passing 5 years back, and logged into the public records database using the library card credentials I'd swiped from my last volunteer shift there, figuring if Lisa could play the part of the ambitious career woman flipping houses for profit, I could unearth the dirt she was trying to bury without resorting to outright confrontation that might tip her off too soon. What I found scrolling through those digital files under the hum of the ceiling fan made my blood run colder than the lake water I'd waded into yesterday, starting with a cascade of liens against Tom and Lisa's property dating back 18 months, triggered by unpaid loans from a credit union that specialized in high-interest deals for folks scraping by after layoffs, the kind of predatory lending that had ensnared half the neighbors during the housing bubble burst when values plummeted and dreams of equity turned to nightmares of foreclosure auctions at the county courthouse steps, and then deeper dives revealed Lisa's name linked to a development firm called Lakeside Ventures, a outfit notorious in local circles for aggressive tactics like pressuring elderly owners to sell undervalued parcels near the water, with transaction logs showing her signing off on inflated appraisals for our family cabin that Harold had deeded to Tom and me jointly. A sneaky maneuver that could force a sale if debts mounted high enough to trigger eminent domain whispers from county officials eyeing tourism bucks. I leaned back in the creaky office chair, rubbing my temples as a wry chuckle escaped me at the sheer gall of it all, because Lisa had always presented herself as the level-headed one during family gatherings, dishing out advice on budgeting apps over slices of her apple pie while eyeing the cabin's prime location with that subtle gleam. But now it clicked how she'd been angling to cash in on the very legacy Tom and I clung to for sanity. The place where we'd hosted Easter egg hunts and 4th of July fireworks that lit up the night sky like fleeting hopes, and the twist that hit hardest came when cross-referencing old bank statements I'd kept in a shoebox for tax purposes uncovered my own skeleton rattling in the closet, a withdrawal from the family emergency fund back in the early 90s that I'd fudged as a clerical error to cover Tom's tuition shortfall after he flunked out. A petty theft from the co-op account we'd all contributed to for rainy days that now mirrored Lisa's sleights of hand, forcing me to confront how my so-called protective instincts had planted the seeds of dishonesty in him long before she entered the picture, making me question if this cycle of cutting corners was less about survival and more about the excuses we all made to sleep at night. With that uncomfortable truth gnawing at me, I printed a few key documents, the printer chugging away like an old engine refusing to quit, and when Lisa texted mid-afternoon asking if I wanted company for lunch, her tone all faux concern after yesterday's awkward exchange, I replied affirmatively, setting the table with the good china Harold's mother had passed down, the floral patterns a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my chest as she arrived bearing a store-bought quiche that smelled of artificial cheese, her smile tight as she settled into the chair across from me, and over bites I steered the conversation to Tom's recent stresses, casually sliding one of the lean notices across the tablecloth like a poker chip in a high-stakes game, watching her fork hover as color drained from her face while she stammered that it was all a misunderstanding from market fluctuations and Tom's impulsive spending on tools for his side hustles, but I pressed on with the motel key card from the suitcase, twirling it between my fingers as evidence of his supposed business trips that didn't align with the dates on these financial red flags. Her denials growing thinner until she admitted he'd been overwhelmed by the debts, but swore the blood on his wallet was from a minor cut at work, nothing more sinister than a hammer slip during a framing job, though her eyes darted to the window overlooking the lake as if expecting it to rise up and swallow her lies whole. As she gathered her things to leave in a flurry of excuses about client meetings, I felt that familiar itch for a measure of retribution. The kind that had served me well in neighborhood spats over fence lines or PTA fundraisers where I'd outmaneuver the pushy types without raising my voice. So later that evening from the public Wi-Fi at the lakeside pavilion where families picnicked and teens loitered on skateboards, I composed an anonymous email to her supervisor at Lakeside Ventures, detailing discrepancies in those appraisal reports with references to public filings but no direct accusations, just enough to spark an internal review that would keep her buried in audits and explanations for days on end. A clever jab that brought a satisfied smirk to my face, because if she thought she could gamble away our shared history for a quick payout, she'd soon learn that tipping the scales came with its own hidden costs, the workplace friction sure to make her sweat without me ever showing my hand. But as twilight deepened and I returned to the cabin with fireflies blinking like hesitant signals in the yard, I delved back into the suitcase one last time under the glow of a bedside lamp, my fingers brushing against a hidden pocket in the lining that yielded a crumpled gas receipt from a station near that Pine Rest motel, time-stamped 2 days after Tom's last known contact. And scrawled on the back in Lisa's looping handwriting was a phone number with a note saying, "Call if he shows, don't let him near the money," the discovery hitting me like a rogue wave because it proved she not only knew where he'd holed up but had been actively tracking him, perhaps to silence whatever loose ends he represented, leaving me clutching the paper in the dim light. The lake's nocturnal chorus outside swelling with the weight of impending revelations that could shatter the fragile remnants of our family ties forever. The gas receipt's implications kept me staring at the ceiling until the wee hours, the wooden beams above creaking faintly as if echoing my unease while the lake outside lapped insistently against the shore like a persistent question I couldn't ignore. Because if Lisa had been one step ahead in hunting down Tom to protect whatever nest egg they'd squirreled away from those shady loans and appraisals, then my anonymous email to her firm was like tossing a match into dry tinder, potentially igniting consequences that rippled back to the cabin and the fragile life Harold and I had built here through decades of summers spent mending nets and sharing stories around the fire pit. The kind of enduring simplicity that now felt threatened by the very family we'd poured our hearts into raising. So when dawn finally broke with a misty veil over the water that blurred the line between sky and lake much like the truths blurring in my mind, I brewed a pot of strong coffee in the percolator. Harold swore by for chasing away fogs of all sorts and resolved to follow her lead directly, tailing Lisa to whatever clandestine meetings she had lined up that day despite the moral twinge in my gut that whispered this level of meddling crossed lines I'd always preached against to my boys about respecting privacy even in tough times like the divorce waves that swept through our neighborhood back in the 90s, but desperation over Tom's fate and the gnawing fear that my past shortcuts had contributed to his current predicament overrode any hesitation, especially with the possibility of a grandchild in the mix that Tom had hinted at during his last visit. A tiny heartbeat I couldn't let get caught in the crossfire of adult deceptions. Slipping into my sensible walking shoes and grabbing the binoculars from the hall closet where they'd gathered a fine layer of dust since my birdwatching phase after Harold's retirement parties wound down, I waited until I heard her SUV crunching over the gravel drive around 9, then eased my old pickup out after her at a discreet distance along the winding county road flanked by stands of birch trees shedding their leaves early this year due to the erratic weather patterns we'd all been griping about at the feed store. The air thick with the scent of damp earth and impending rain that matched the storm clouds gathering in my thoughts as she turned off toward the old mill district in the neighboring town, a once thriving hub of textile factories now repurposed into a mishmash of artisan shops and vacant lots that locals eyed warily for the influx of outsiders bringing big city schemes disguised as progress. Parking in a shadowed alley behind a row of shuttered storefronts where graffiti tagged the bricks with messages of discontent that resonated all too familiarly with my own simmering frustrations, I watched her enter a nondescript coffee shop through the steamed windows, the kind of place with mismatched mugs and chalkboard menus, advertising fair trade brews that appealed to the weekend crowd from Syracuse seeking a taste of authentic upstate life. And there she met a man in a sharply tailored suit that screamed city slicker amid the flannel-clad regulars, their heads bent over a laptop screen displaying what looked like subdivision plans overlaid on satellite images of our lakeside properties. His gestures animated as he pointed to profit projections while her nods came with that calculated enthusiasm I'd seen her use at open houses to close deals on homes folks couldn't really afford. From my vantage across the street, hunkered in the cab with the engine off to avoid drawing attention, I adjusted the binoculars and caught fragments of their exchange carried on the breeze through the propped-open door, phrases like, "Final payout after the insurance clears," and "Keep the old lady out of it until the paperwork's ironclad," that tied directly back to the fraudulent loans I'd uncovered, making my stomach twist. Because this investor wasn't just a business associate, but a partner in crime who could drag Tom deeper into legal quicksand if he ever resurfaced. And the humor of the situation struck me then in a dark way as I stifled a chuckle at how I'd become the nosy neighbor from those Lifetime movies we watched on stormy evenings, binoculars in hand like some amateur sleuth chasing shadows instead of tending my victory garden out back. But the levity evaporated when the man slid a small black case across the table, which Lisa opened to reveal the handgun from the suitcase, its familiar grip sending a jolt through me as memories flooded back of my own youthful folly in the late 60s when I'd borrowed it from my father's collection during a heated breakup with a boyfriend who thought he could push me around, using it to scare him off in a fit of misguided bravado that I'd buried along with the story, never imagining it would resurface tied to my son's troubles like a bad penny rolling through generations. The dilemma hit hard then, weighing whether to intervene and risk exposing my connection to the weapon, which could paint me as complicit in whatever scheme unfolded, or hold back to protect the potential grandchild Lisa might be carrying. A choice that would surely have anyone listening to this tale side-eyeing my priorities for endangering innocence with my vengeful pursuits. But as they wrapped up with a handshake that lingered too long for mere colleagues, I snapped a few photos on my phone. The shutter sound muffled by the passing traffic of delivery trucks rumbling past, and slipped away before they emerged, my heart racing with the weight of that gun's history now intertwining with the present chaos like vines overtaking the dock's pilings over time. Back at the cabin by early afternoon, with the sky darkening to match my mood as fat raindrops began splattering the windshield, I stashed the phone in a drawer and paced the living room where Harold's recliner still bore the imprint of his frame, contemplating my next move when Lisa showed up uninvited around dusk, her hair frizzed from the downpour and eyes narrowed in accusation, as she demanded to know if I'd been following her. The confrontation unfolding in the kitchen under the harsh fluorescent light that buzzed like my nerves while she paced, and I poured us both mugs of chamomile to diffuse the tension, but instead of denying it outright, I steered us to the photo albums on the shelf, flipping deliberately to a yellowed picture from Tom's 21st birthday, where he posed proudly with that very pistol I'd gifted him as a misguided symbol of manhood, her sharp intake of breath confirming she recognized it as the one from their arguments. And I quipped with a wry edge that some family heirlooms had a funny way of coming back to bite you in the backside, especially when mixed with bad decisions like inflating property values to line pockets at the expense of legacies built on sweat and sacrifice. She fired back then, her voice rising over the drumming rain on the tin roof, accusing me of pushing Tom into this life of shortcuts by spoiling him with endless rescues from his messes. From bailing him out of juvenile scrapes to co-signing loans that enabled his gambling flings at the reservation casino up the road, her words landing like slaps because they echoed doubts I'd harbored in quiet moments staring at the lake, wondering if my overprotectiveness had crippled rather than shielded him. And as she stormed toward the door mid-rant, I couldn't resist a parting shot of revenge by pulling out my phone and forwarding one of those meeting photos to the family email chain under the guise of catching up on Lisa's busy schedule, attaching a vague caption about her new friends in development that I knew would circulate through the aunts and cousins like wildfire at the next potluck, isolating her socially in our tight-knit circle without a single outright lie. The satisfaction blooming warm in my chest like the first sip of bourbon on a cold night, because if she wanted to play the villain in our family drama, I'd ensure the audience turned against her subtly but surely. Yet as her taillights faded into the sheeting rain, a thunderclap rattled the windows and my resolve, leaving me alone with the album open to that damning photo, the pistol's shadow long across the page, and the realization that Lisa's final hurled words about my role in Tom's disappearance might hold more truth than I cared to admit, her accusation hanging in the air like the ozone sent after the storm, forcing me to question if I'd driven him away not with love but with the very deceptions I'd passed down like a cursed inheritance. Lisa's parting accusation about my role in Tom's troubles echoed through the cabin like the persistent drip from the eaves after the storm had passed, leaving me slumped in Harold's old recliner with the photo album still open on my lap. The image of young Tom cradling that pistol now superimposed in my mind over the bloodied wallet from the suitcase, a haunting reminder that the choices I'd made to shield him from hardships, whether slipping funds from the community pot to cover his early mistakes or turning a blind eye to his increasingly erratic behaviors in recent years, had woven a tangled web where every thread pulled at the fabric of our family, potentially unraveling the very security I'd fought to provide through long hours at the bank and frugal weekends, mending clothes instead of splurging on outings, all in the name of giving him a leg up in a world that had chewed up his father's generation with factory closures and economic downturns that left so many like us clinging to properties like this cabin as lifelines to better days remembered around crackling campfires and shared plates of fresh-caught trout. The rain had tapered to a fine mist by morning, veiling the lake in a soft gray that mirrored the fog in my thoughts as I rose stiffly to face the day, deciding that passive regret wouldn't cut it anymore and that I needed hard facts from official sources to counter Lisa's manipulations. So I dressed in my practical khakis and a fleece pullover suited for the chill and drove the winding roads to the county clerk's office in the county seat, the building a squat brick affair surrounded by parking lots filled with civil servant sedans and the occasional harried family hauling in stacks of paperwork for estate settlements that always seemed to stir up more ghosts than resolutions, much like the one I was chasing now with visions of Tom's faked absence and Lisa's investor dalliances dancing in my head. Once inside, navigating the labyrinth of hallways, lined with fluorescent strips that buzzed overhead like nagging doubts, I sweet-talked the receptionist, a woman named Doris who'd known Harold from the VFW fundraisers, into letting me access the property records room where microfiche machines hummed alongside modern scanners, and as I pored over deeds and liens under the scent of musty paper and stale coffee from the break room down the hall, the full scope of the scam unfolded before me in stark black and white entries that revealed Lisa and her suited partner had not only leveraged the cabin as collateral for a ballooning loan exceeding $200,000, but had also initiated quiet proceedings to partition the land for a luxury condo development, complete with environmental waivers greased by campaign donations to local officials who'd long eyed the lakeshore for tourism revenue to offset budget shortfalls from declining mill taxes. A betrayal that hit like a gut punch, because this wasn't just financial opportunism but a calculated erasure of the summers we'd spent here building sandcastles with the grandkids and launching fireworks that painted the sky in bursts of red, white, and blue, traditions Harold cherished as much as his morning coffee ritual. The twist that nearly buckled my knees came when cross-checking transaction timestamps against Tom's credit reports pulled from a public aggregator site on my phone showed withdrawals from joint accounts hitting his card in patterns matching Lisa's meeting dates, proving he wasn't a victim swept away by her schemes, but an active participant who'd staged his vanishing act to trigger a life insurance policy I'd co-signed during one of his low points after a casino binge left him hollow-eyed and begging for help. The payout structured to flow through offshore channels that screamed tax evasion and money laundering on a scale that could land us all in hot water if the feds ever sniffed around, forcing me to confront the bitter humor in how my so-called support had enabled a son clever enough to play dead for dollars while leaving me to mop up the emotional and legal fallout like a chambermaid in one of those roadside motels he favored for hideouts. Back in the truck with a folder of copied documents clutched like contraband, the mist turning to drizzle that smeared the windshield as I merged onto the highway, I grappled with the dilemma of going straight to the sheriff's office with this evidence. After all, possession of that gun alone made me complicit, and spilling about the fraud could clear the air but also expose my own past discrepancies like that church fund dip that might resurface in background checks, yet the audience to this unfolding drama in my imagination would no doubt judge me harshly for even considering a lie to the authorities, prioritizing family loyalty over the rule of law in a way that smacked of the very shortcuts I'd decried in others during neighborhood watch meetings, but with the grandchild's future hanging in the balance. I opted for the shadowed path of an anonymous report to the state insurance fraud hotline, dictating details into a voice memo app while parked at a scenic overlook where the lake stretched out below like a vast, indifferent mirror. The half-truths omitting my direct ties just enough to spark an investigation without pulling me under immediately. By late afternoon, having returned to the cabin where the damp air clung to everything like unspoken resentments, Lisa called with a voice laced in syrupy reconciliation, inviting herself over for what she termed a heart-to-heart about Tom's stresses and her worries for the family, and when she arrived with a tin of homemade brownies that masked the tension in her posture, I played the gracious host pouring herbal tea in the sunroom overlooking the now calming waters. But as conversation flowed from weather pleasantries to deeper currents, I revealed snippets from the clerk's findings, sliding a deed excerpt across the wicker table to watch her composure fracture like thin lake ice under spring thaw, her admission tumbling out that yes, the pregnancy test she'd taken weeks ago confirmed a baby on the way, Tom's child that she'd kept secret to avoid complicating the insurance claim. Her eyes pleading for understanding as she explained how the debts had spiraled from his gambling and her failed flips, turning their marriage into a pressure cooker where faking his death seemed like the only escape valve, though her voice cracked with the weight of carrying this alone while he hid out waiting for the checks to clear. The revelation softened something in me momentarily, visions of nursery rhymes and tiny hands grasping mine during visits flashing through my mind, but her casual dismissal of the cabin's sentimental value reignited the fire, leading me to quip that some folks treated family heirlooms like poker chips in a game they couldn't afford to lose, and as she gathered her things amid rising voices that echoed off the paneled walls, vowing to lawyer up for her share of the property regardless of the fallout, I bided my time for a fitting reprisal that matched her deceptions in subtlety, waiting until she stepped out to fetch a forgotten scarf from her car before slipping into the garage where her SUV idled, and with a quick twist of a loose hose clamp on the fuel line, nothing permanent, but enough to cause a sputter and stall a few miles down the road, I ensured she'd miss her critical closing meeting with the investor the next morning, the petty sabotage bringing a sly grin to my face as I imagined her stranded on the roadside with a tow truck. A light payback that evened the score without drawing blood, because if she wanted to drive roughshod over our bonds for profit, she'd find the journey far bumpier than anticipated. Yet as evening shadows lengthened across the yard where the wild asters bloomed defiantly against the encroaching dusk, a nondescript envelope slipped under the cabin door caught my eye, containing a prepaid cell phone that buzzed to life with a single voicemail upon activation, Tom's voice crackling through the speaker hoarse and urgent as he whispered, "Mom, it's me, Lisa's in deeper than you know with those developers. And I'm alive, but can't come back yet. Meet me at the old fishing spot tomorrow night if you want the full truth. The message cutting off into silence that left me gripping the device with white-knuckled hands. The lake's evening hush. Outside, amplifying the pounding of my heart as the pieces of this puzzle shifted once more, hinting at dangers closing in from all sides. Tom's voicemail on that burner phone played over and over in my mind through the sleepless hours that followed. His voice a fractured echo of the boy who'd once dragged me on adventures around the lake in a leaky rowboat we patched with duct tape and determination. Promising adventures that would outshine the ones his father and I shared during our courtship days when gas was cheap and worries seemed confined to the horizon, but now those words carried the weight of deceptions layered thicker. Then the fog rolling off Willow Lake at midnight, hinting at layers to Lisa's involvement that went beyond mere complicity in his faked disappearance, pulling me into a vortex where my own history of bending rules to keep the peace, whether covering for his teenage pranks or quietly forgiving his adult lapses into debt, had set the stage for this elaborate charade designed to squeeze insurance dollars from policies I'd naively backed, leaving me to wonder if the family bonds I'd nurtured so fiercely were nothing more than illusions sustained by half-truths and overlooked red flags that now threatened to capsize everything we'd built over decades of shared holidays and quiet evenings watching sunsets paint the water in hues of fire and gold. Dawn crept in hesitantly, the sky a bruised purple that matched the ache in my chest as I pocketed the phone and slipped out to the dock before the birds fully stirred. The wood slick from overnight dew and groaning under my steps like it anticipated the confrontation ahead. My resolve steeling against the moral quagmire of meeting Tom in secret when Lisa's pregnancy added a layer of vulnerability that any sensible person would see as reason to call in the professionals rather than play vigilante in the twilight of my years, a choice that would undoubtedly draw disapproval from those imagining this tale for its recklessness in prioritizing personal reckonings over the safety of an unborn child caught in the crosshairs of grown-up greeds and grudges. I texted Lisa mid-morning with a curt invitation to the dock at noon, framing it as a final chance to hash out the property mess before lawyers turned it into a battlefield, and when she arrived precisely on time, her figure silhouetted against the shimmering water with a hand protectively over her still flat belly, the air between us crackled with the unresolved tensions from our last clash, her eyes scanning my face for signs of weakness as we stood there amid the scent of wet pine and distant wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, the lake's gentle waves lapping at the pilings like whispers urging confessions that neither of us wanted to voice first. She started with pleas for unity, spinning a narrative of how Tom's gambling had spiraled out of control after a string of bad luck on construction bids that left them drowning in interest payments from lenders who preyed on folks like us in Rust Belt towns where jobs vanished faster than seasonal tourists. But I cut through her rehearsed sympathy by pulling the unloaded pistol from my jacket pocket, its weight a cold reminder of the youthful indiscretions I'd buried deeper than this lake's silt, and offering it handle first, watching her fingers tremble as she accepted it. The metal glinting in the midday sun like a reluctant truth finally unearthed after years of dormancy. With that gesture as a bridge, the floodgates opened, her admissions tumbling out in a rush that the rain-slicked dock seemed to absorb, revealing how Tom had orchestrated the entire vanishing act with her reluctant assistance, staging a bloody scene in their garage using stage makeup from a community theater prop box and that muffled bang from a misfired signal flare he'd packed in the suitcase to simulate peril, all to trigger the $500,000 policy payout that would clear their debts and fund a fresh start away from the lakeside pressures, though he'd double-crossed her by absconding with the bulk of the preliminary funds wired to a joint account, leaving her to fend off the investors' demands alone while carrying the secret of their child, a boy due in spring who might never know the grandfatherly tales Harold would have spun by this very water. The twist that knifed deepest came when she pulled a folded letter from her purse, Tom's handwriting confessing not just the scam, but blaming me squarely for his moral compass gone awry, detailing how my church fund slight in his youth had taught him that ends justified means in a family where love meant endless bailouts, from tuition covers to casino losses. Choices I'd made with the best intentions, but now saw as the rotten roots feeding this tree of deceit, making my throat tighten with a mix of rage and regret, because the audience to this unraveling would surely balk at how I'd enabled the very monster staring back from the water's reflection, my overprotectiveness morphing into a poison that tainted generations. As our voices rose in a heated exchange that echoed across the empty cove, thunder rumbling in the distance like the approach of inevitable consequences, the investor's sleek sedan crunched up the drive, his face thunderous from the stalled deals and audit probes I'd anonymously ignited, forcing Lisa into a corner where she had to choose between spilling everything to him and risking arrest or clinging to the lie with me as a reluctant ally. And in that charged moment laced with the dark humor of our absurd standoff, 3 generations worth of folly converging on a dock built for lazy afternoons, I stepped forward with calculated boldness, raising my voice to declare loudly that Lisa held irrefutable proof of Tom's survival in the form of that burner phone clutched in my other hand, waving it like a white flag laced with barbs as I detailed the fraud in broad strokes for his ears, the public exposure of final revenge that crumbled his investment dreams like sandcastles at high tide while sparing Lisa immediate cuffs for the baby's sake. Satisfying in its witty precision, because if she'd aimed to bury our secrets, I'd dredged them up for all to see, stranding her professionally adrift without a single physical blow landed. Sirens wailed faintly from the direction of town as my earlier tips bore fruit with responding investigators, and then from the tree lean where the maples clustered thick, Tom emerged haggard and hollow-cheeked. His embrace of Lisa tentative but real as he avoided my gaze, the family coalescing in fractured reunion amid the gathering clouds, apologies mumbled about starting over with the insurance frozen and debts exposed. Yet as they piled into her car and drove away toward an uncertain horizon, leaving me alone on the dock with the empty suitcase at my feet like a discarded skin, the weight of isolation settled heavy upon me, the lake's depths murmuring ambiguities that no revelation could fully silence. Had Lisa's tears been genuine redemption or just another layer of performance, and had my vengeful path freed us from the cycle or merely isolated me as the villain in their revised narrative, the final questions rippling outward like endless waves, pondering the true cost of retribution in a family where love's echoes often drowned in the undertow of unspoken regrets.